During his illustrious career, he'd witnessed Vorthan students accidentally poison themselves with what they thought was recreational reading material, watched a crystalline delegate literally shatter from embarrassment during a presentation on reproductive customs, and once had to evacuate an entire lecture hall when a Cathari exchange student's emotional support parasite went into heat and started broadcasting pheromones that made everyone within a 50-meter radius want to either mate or declare war. Sometimes both. But in all his years of academic service, dealing with the various neuroses, biological incompatibilities, and cultural clusterfucks that came with teaching a multi-species curriculum, Professor Zixthrail had never, and I cannot stress this enough, never had to deal with anything quite like the human sitting in the third row. The human in question went by the designation Danny, which was apparently short for Daniel, though why any species would voluntarily shorten their names was beyond the professor's comprehension. Humans, as Zixthral had learned through painful experience, had a disturbing tendency to do things that made absolutely no logical sense and then act like everyone else was the weird one for pointing it out. Danny looked perfectly ordinary by human standards, which was to say he looked like a barely contained biological weapon wrapped in what humans inexplicably called business casual. He had the typical human arrangement of features: 2 eyes, 1 nose, 1 mouth, all positioned in the configuration that somehow convinced other species that humans were relatively harmless, right up until they started explaining their recreational activities. Now then, Professor Zixthral began, his translator box rendering his native Zephyrian clicks and whistles into the sterile diplomatic common tongue. Today we'll be discussing conflict resolution techniques as employed by various species. Who can give me an example of how their homeworld handles territorial disputes? A Gellian student, all tentacles and good intentions, raised what might generously be called a hand. On Gellia Prime, we engage in ritual combat using traditional ceremonial weapons until first blood is drawn, at which point both parties share a meal and discuss terms. Excellent, Kurthu. And the Valdorians? The Valdorian representative, a being that looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a filing cabinet, spoke in their characteristic monotone. Economic sanctions followed by arbitrated negotiation. Violence is reserved only for matters of species survival. Wonderful! And humans? Zixthral turned to Danny with the same expression his ancestors might have worn when approaching a suspiciously ticking gift box. How does Earth handle territorial conflicts? Danny leaned back in his chair, a piece of furniture that had been specifically reinforced after the Great Chair Collapse incident of Cycle 2847, when a human exchange student had forgotten that not all furniture was built to withstand Deathworlder physics. Well, he said, with the casual air of someone discussing weather patterns. Historically speaking, we tried everything from strongly worded letters to genocide, but these days we mostly just threaten to nuke each other until someone blinks. The classroom fell into the kind of silence usually reserved for funeral services and tax audits. I'm sorry, Professor Zixthral said, his translator box making a small whimpering sound that it had never made before. Did you say genocide? Oh yeah, Danny nodded cheerfully. We got really creative with it too. Wars of conquest, wars of religion, wars because someone looked at someone else funny. There was this one time we had a war that lasted 100 years because 2 royal families couldn't agree on who had the prettier hat. Well, okay, it was technically about succession rights, but the hat thing was definitely a factor. Karthu's tentacles had gone rigid with shock. Your species regularly engages in warfare? Engages in it? Buddy, we perfected it. We turned killing each other into an art form. We wrote poetry about it. We made it entertaining. Hell, some of our greatest cultural achievements came out of figuring out new and exciting ways to murder our neighbors. The Valdorian's mandibles began the kind of nervous clicking that indicated either deep thought or an impending mechanical breakdown. But surely your species has evolved beyond such primitive responses. Danny's grin was the sort that made prey animals across the galaxy suddenly develop an urgent need to be elsewhere. Oh, we've evolved all right. See, the thing about humans is that we never really stop being primitive. We just get better tools. Professor Zixthral felt a familiar migraine building behind his compound eyes. This was exactly the kind of conversation that led to diplomatic incidents, emergency faculty meetings, and strongly worded memos from the University Ethics Committee. Mr. Daniel, perhaps we should focus on more constructive approaches to conflict resolution? Hey, I'm being constructive, Danny protested. I'm explaining how we used to do things. These days we're much more civilized. Now we mostly just crash our economy into your economy until one of us cries uncle, or we hack into your infrastructure and turn your traffic lights into a disco. Much more efficient than actual invasion. That's not better. whispered a small, furry creature from the back row that Professor Zixthral was pretty sure was either a fizzblat or someone's emotional support pet. It was honestly difficult to tell sometimes. Are you kidding? It's way better! No messy cleanup, minimal casualties, and you get to keep all your stuff afterward. Plus, economic warfare has the added bonus of being completely legal under most galactic treaties, because nobody thought to specifically ban it. Danny paused thoughtfully. Well, nobody except humans thought to specifically ban it, and even then we only banned the really obvious stuff. The crystalline student, a being who communicated primarily through controlled light emissions and was currently flashing what the professor recognized as profound concern, pulsed rapidly. The translator rendered their photonic language as query. Human definition of really obvious stuff in context of economic warfare? Oh, you know, the classics. Price manipulation, market flooding, currency destabilization, resource monopolization, targeted infrastructure failure. Danny ticked off items on his fingers like he was listing grocery items. The kind of stuff that's so blatantly aggressive that even we couldn't pretend it was just aggressive free market capitalism with a straight face. There's a difference? Krathos' tentacles were now writhing in what Professor Zixthral recognized as the Gellian equivalent of existential crisis. Of course there's a difference! One is an act of war and the other is just Tuesday morning on Earth. It's all about plausible deniability and making sure your lawyers are better than their lawyers. Professor Zixthral decided it was time to regain control of his classroom before Danny accidentally started an interstellar incident. Again, perhaps we should move on to peaceful resolution techniques. Oh, we've got those too! Danny interrupted with enthusiasm that would have been endearing if it weren't so terrifying. Mediation, arbitration, international courts, economic partnerships, cultural exchange programs, strategic marriages, hostage-taking. Hostage-taking is not a peaceful resolution technique. The professor's translator box actually sparked with the effort of rendering his indignant screech. Well, not with that attitude it isn't, Danny said reasonably. But historically speaking, it's been incredibly effective. You grab someone important, make your demands, negotiate terms, and everybody goes home happy. Except maybe the hostage, but if you pick the right person, they usually end up with Stockholm Syndrome anyway, so it works out. The classroom had descended into the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters in reality television. Students were staring at Danny with the same expression their ancestors might have worn when first encountering fire. Equal parts amazed and terrified that such a thing could exist. Your species, the Valdorian said slowly, treats hostage-taking as a legitimate diplomatic tool. Treats it? We practically invented the modern version. Pirates, privateers, political kidnapping, ransom demands. We turned what used to be simple robbery into a sophisticated negotiation strategy. Some of our greatest diplomatic breakthroughs happened because someone grabbed the right person at the right time and made the right demands. Professor Zixthral felt his life force slowly draining away. In approximately 10 minutes, this human had managed to make his entire curriculum seem woefully inadequate. How was he supposed to teach interspecies diplomacy when one of the species apparently considered kidnapping a valid opening gambit? But surely, he said weakly, your modern diplomatic corps doesn't actually employ such creative methods. Danny's expression suggested that this was perhaps not the safest assumption to make. Well, we don't call it hostage-taking anymore. These days it's usually something like protective custody or voluntary restriction of movement or enhanced negotiation positioning. But the basic principle remains the same. You control access to something or someone the other party wants, and you use that leverage to achieve your objectives. That's just diplomacy with extra steps, the fizzblat emotional support pet squeaked. Exactly. See, you're getting it. Humans didn't invent diplomacy, but we definitely perfected the art of making it sound civilized while keeping all the fun bits. Danny leaned forward conspiratorially. The secret is in the terminology. You're never threatening anyone. You're clearly communicating potential consequences. You're not extorting concessions. You're facilitating mutually beneficial outcomes. You're not manipulating the situation. You're optimizing negotiation parameters. Krathos made a sound that the translator rendered as confused tentacle slapping. But that's just semantics. Welcome to human diplomacy. We've turned semantics into a weapon of mass destruction. We can make a declaration of war sound like a birthday party invitation, and a peace treaty read like a death threat, sometimes in the same document. The crystalline student flashed what Professor Zixthral was fairly certain was the light-based equivalent of a nervous breakdown. This explains so much about human diplomatic correspondence. Yeah, our translators have to work overtime just to figure out whether you're being friendly or planning to glass our homeworld, Danny agreed cheerfully. Half the time we're not even sure ourselves until after we've sent the message and seen how you react. Professor Zixthral realized he was witnessing what scholars would later term a teachable moment. The kind of educational opportunity that either resulted in breakthrough understanding or total systemic collapse. Possibly both. Mr. Daniel, he said carefully, are you suggesting that human diplomatic communications are deliberately ambiguous? Deliberately? Oh, absolutely. Ambiguity is like our diplomatic superpower. See, if you make everything crystal clear, then everyone knows exactly where they stand, and that's boring. But if you keep things just vague enough, then everyone has to spend all their time trying to figure out what you actually meant. And while they're doing that, you can change your position 3 or 4 times and they'll never notice. That's not how diplomacy is supposed to work, the Valdorian protested, though their tone suggested growing uncertainty about what diplomacy was supposed to be. Says who? The Galactic Diplomatic Accords? Because humans weren't involved in writing those, and we definitely didn't sign off on the parts about clear communication and good faith negotiation. We added our own amendments. Professor Zixthral felt a cold certainty settling in his stomach. What kind of amendments? Danny's smile was the sort that made small animals play dead and large animals seriously consider relocation. Oh, just some clarifications. Like, good faith negotiation doesn't necessarily mean you have to stay in good faith throughout the entire process. And clear communication is subject to cultural interpretation. What's clear to us might not be clear to you, and vice versa. That's not clarification, Kurthu wailed. That's deliberately creating loopholes. Now you're getting it. See, the thing about humans is that we don't break rules. We find creative interpretations of them. It's completely different. How is that different? Legal precedent, Danny said smugly. If we broke the rules, that would be a violation, and you could call us on it. But if we creatively interpret them, then that becomes part of the established diplomatic framework, and suddenly everyone else has to deal with our interpretation being just as valid as the original intent. The professor was beginning to understand why human diplomatic missions required such extensive security details, and why those security details looked less like ceremonial guards and more like tactical response teams. This, he said faintly, explains so much about the current state of galactic politics. Really? Because from where I'm sitting, galactic politics seems pretty tame. I mean, sure, there's the occasional trade war or territorial dispute, but where's the passion? Where are the dramatic betrayals? The shocking reversals? The last-minute revelations that completely change everything? We prefer stability, the Valdorian said stiffly. Stability is overrated. Stability is what you get when nobody cares enough to fight about anything. Earth has never had a stable day in its entire history, and look how well we turned out. The collective silence that greeted this statement suggested that the class had some opinions about how well humans had turned out, and those opinions were not entirely positive. I mean, Danny continued, blissfully unaware of or deliberately ignoring the horrified stares. Your average galactic diplomatic crisis lasts for what, maybe a few standard cycles? Gets resolved through careful negotiation and measured compromise? Where's the fun in that? Diplomacy isn't supposed to be fun, Professor Zixthral said weakly. Says who? Human diplomatic crises are incredibly entertaining. Take the Cuban Missile Crisis. We brought the entire planet to the brink of nuclear annihilation over some rockets in the wrong place, and the whole thing played out like the galaxy's most expensive game of chicken. 13 days of pure diplomatic theater, both sides posturing and bluffing and trying to figure out who was going to blink first. And that was entertaining? The crystalline student pulsed uncertainly. Are you kidding? It was riveting. Secret negotiations, back-channel communications, dramatic deadline ultimatums, the whole works. Plus, it gave us some of the best diplomatic quotes in human history. Such as? Professor Zixthral asked against his better judgment. Oh, the classics. We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked. The other guy has to back down first. If we back down, we lose face. Pure diplomatic poetry. Karthu's tentacles were now performing what could only be described as interpretive dance, expressing profound confusion. But you were discussing nuclear weapons, right? That's what made it so intense. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The tension was incredible. And everyone involved knew that one wrong move could end civilization as we know it. It was like the ultimate high-stakes negotiation. That is not entertainment! Professor Zixthral shrieked, his translator box now emitting small puffs of smoke. That is existential terror. Same thing, really. The only difference is perspective. The professor stared at Danny for a long moment, during which several fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality crumbled into dust. Mr. Daniel, are you telling this class that your species finds the threat of mutual annihilation entertaining? Well, not all of us. But enough of us to keep things interesting. See, the thing about humans is that we have this weird relationship with danger. Most species try to avoid it, right? Sensible approach. But humans? We see danger and think, hey, that looks fun. How can we make it more dangerous? The fizzblat in the back row made a sound like a deflating balloon. That's completely irrational. Irrational? That's the most rational thing humans do. Think about it. If you spend all your time avoiding danger, you never learn how to handle it when it shows up anyway. But if you actively seek out dangerous situations and practice dealing with them, then when real danger comes along, you're ready for it. Or, the Valdorian pointed out with mechanical precision, you die horribly because you've actively sought out dangerous situations. Well, yeah, that happens too. But the ones who don't die horribly become really, really good at not dying horribly. And then they have kids, and the whole species gets better at not dying horribly. It's evolution in action! Professor Zixthral was fairly certain that wasn't how evolution was supposed to work. But at this point, he was no longer sure about anything. Mr. Daniel, are you saying that humans deliberately expose themselves to mortal danger for educational purposes? Educational, recreational, professional, philosophical, you name it. We've probably found a way to make it life-threatening and then call it a hobby. Danny began counting on his fingers again. Mountain climbing, deep-sea diving, skydiving, base jumping, cave exploration, storm chasing, martial arts, contact sports, experimental cuisine. Experimental cuisine? Carthu interrupted. Oh yeah, we'll eat anything at least once, just to see what happens. Poisonous fish, fermented shark, peppers that can literally blind you, cheese that's technically toxic waste. If it might kill us, someone's probably figured out how to serve it as a delicacy. The crystalline student flashed what Professor Zixthral was now recognizing as the light pattern for imminent mental breakdown. Your species voluntarily consumes potentially lethal substances for pleasure. For science, Danny corrected. Also for bragging rights, cultural tradition, tourism revenue, and sometimes just because someone dared us to. You'd be amazed how many human innovations started with someone saying, I bet you can't. Or, what would happen if we... This explains the human section of the Galactic Medical Database, the professor muttered. The human medical files were legendary among university staff. Not for their medical sophistication, but for their sheer creative diversity. Humans apparently had an unmatched talent for finding new and interesting ways to injure themselves. Yeah, we keep your doctors busy, don't we? But hey, all that practice makes them really good at their jobs. Human medics are in demand all over the galaxy now because they've seen every conceivable type of injury, and a few that were previously thought to be impossible. Because your species keeps inventing new ways to hurt yourselves. Exactly. See, everyone else thinks that's a bug, but we think it's a feature. Every new injury is a learning opportunity. Every accident is a chance to improve our medical knowledge. Every near-death experience is data we can use to push the boundaries of what's survivable. The Valdorian's clicking had reached a frequency that was making everyone's translator boxes vibrate ominously. You treat your own mortality as an experimental parameter? Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of weird, Danny admitted. But look at the results! Humans have one of the most advanced medical technologies in the galaxy. We've got survival rates that make other species weep with envy, and we can bounce back from injuries that would permanently disable most other life forms. All because we've spent thousands of years accidentally maiming ourselves in creative ways. That's not how medical advancement is supposed to work, Professor Zixthral protested. Says who? Your medical advancement probably came from careful study and systematic research, right? Ethical guidelines, controlled conditions, peer review, all that boring stuff? Yes, because that's how rational beings conduct scientific research. And I bet it took forever and produced very conservative results, Danny said with a sympathetic shake of his head. Human medical research is way more efficient. We just go out and do stupid stuff until something breaks, then we figure out how to fix it. Faster, more practical, and way more exciting than sitting around in laboratories making hypotheses. But people die during your research? Some people die. But way more people don't die, and that's how we make progress. Plus, the ones who do die usually go out doing something they loved, like wrestling alligators or trying to surf hurricanes, so it's not like they're suffering. Carthu's tentacles had now formed what could only be described as a geometrically impossible knot. Humans? Surf? Hurricanes? Oh, absolutely. Storm surfing is huge back home. You get out there on the edge of a hurricane, catch a wave that's 3 stories tall and moving at about 60 kilometers per hour, and just ride it for as long as you can before the wind picks you up and throws you into next week. Why? Because it's awesome. And because regular surfing got boring after we figured out how to do it without dying most of the time. So naturally we had to find a way to make it dangerous again. The professor felt his sanity slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Mr. Daniel, are you telling this class that humans deliberately made a recreational activity more dangerous because it had become too safe? Well, yeah, that's just good sense. If something stops being challenging, what's the point of doing it? Danny looked around at the assembled students with genuine confusion. I mean, you guys must have something like that, right? Some activity that you keep making more difficult as you get better at it. The collective silence suggested that no, they did not have anything like that. Seriously? Nothing? No competitive sports where you keep raising the stakes? No extreme hobbies that push the limits of what's survivable? No recreational activities that require emergency medical personnel on standby? No, Professor Zixthral exclaimed. Normal species develop recreational activities that are relaxing and safe, and don't require medical intervention. That sounds incredibly boring, Danny said sympathetically. What do you do for excitement? We read books. We contemplate the beauty of the universe. We engage in philosophical discourse. Okay, but what do you do when you want to get your blood pumping? When you want to feel really alive? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Professor Zixthral realized that he had never, in his entire academic career, needed to explain the concept of not wanting to feel like you're about to die to a student. Mr. Daniel, he said carefully, most species prefer recreational activities that do not activate their fight or flight response. But that's the best part. The adrenaline rush, the heightened awareness, the way everything becomes crystal clear when you're right on the edge between success and disaster. That's when you know you're really living. That's when most species know they're probably about to stop living. Exactly. That's what makes it so intense. The crystalline student flashed what Professor Zixthral was fairly certain was the optical equivalent of a scream. Your species voluntarily triggers survival responses. For entertainment? For entertainment. For personal growth. For social bonding. For spiritual enlightenment, you name it. Some of our most profound cultural experiences involve deliberately putting ourselves in situations where we might not make it out alive. Such as? The Valdorian asked, though their tone suggested they were already regretting the question. Vision quests, extreme sports, military service, experimental art, investigative journalism, space exploration, deep ocean research, volcano studies. Those last few are legitimate scientific endeavors. Professor Zixthral protested. Sure, but that doesn't mean they're not also incredibly dangerous and exciting. Human scientists get to have fun with their research. We don't just study volcanoes from a safe distance, we get right up close and personal with them. We don't just observe deep ocean trenches, we go down there and poke around. We don't just look at space through telescopes, we build rockets and go visit it. Because you have a death wish. Because we have a life wish. We want to experience everything the universe has to offer, even if it kills us. Especially if it might kill us, because that means it's probably worth experiencing. The professor stared at Danny for a long moment, feeling the last vestiges of his faith in rational discourse crumble away. Mr. Daniel, do you understand that most species consider survival to be more important than experience? Well, sure, but what's the point of surviving if you're not really living? I mean, you could spend your whole life being perfectly safe and comfortable, but then you'd never know what you were capable of. You'd never discover your limits, never push your boundaries, never find out what you're really made of. We know what we're made of. Carbon-based organic compounds arranged in increasingly complex molecular structures. That's not what I meant, and you know it, Danny said with a grin that suggested he was enjoying this conversation far more than anyone else in the room. I'm talking about character, resilience, the ability to face the unknown and keep going even when you're scared out of your mind. Why would we want to be scared out of our minds? Because that's when you find out who you really are. Anyone can be brave when they're safe. Anyone can be confident when there's no risk. But when everything's on the line and failure means death or worse, that's when you discover what you're actually capable of. Krathos made a sound that the translator couldn't even begin to render into comprehensible language. Humans deliberately seek out life-threatening situations. For self-improvement? Among other reasons, yeah. We call it character building. The theory is that if you can handle the worst possible situation, everything else becomes manageable by comparison. That's completely insane, is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like a pretty effective strategy. Humans are adaptable, resilient, innovative, and incredibly hard to kill. We can survive in environments that would wipe out most other species. We can recover from injuries and disasters that would cripple other civilizations. and we can solve problems that other species don't even recognize as solvable. Because you create most of those problems in the first place. Well, yeah, but we also solve them, which is the important part. Plus, all that practice dealing with problems we created makes us really good at dealing with problems we didn't create. Professor Zixthral felt a profound certainty that this conversation was going to be referenced in academic papers for the next several cycles, probably with titles like Death Worlder Psychology, a case study in systematic insanity, or When Students Accidentally Redefine Your Entire Curriculum, a cautionary tale. Mr. Daniel, he said with the careful tone of someone trying to defuse a diplomatic incident, while your species' approach to life is certainly unique, perhaps we should return to our discussion of conventional diplomatic practices. Oh, but this is conventional diplomatic practice. At least it is for humans. See, everything I've been telling you about human recreational activities? All of that applies to human diplomacy too. We don't just negotiate agreements. We turn negotiation into a competitive sport. We don't just resolve conflicts. We make conflict resolution into an art form. The professor felt his compound eyes begin to twitch. How so? Well, take your average interspecies trade negotiation. Most species probably approach it like a collaborative problem-solving exercise, right? Everyone sits down, identifies their needs and constraints, and works together to find a mutually beneficial solution. That is indeed how rational beings conduct trade negotiations, the Valdorian confirmed. Boring, Danny declared. Human trade negotiations are way more exciting. First, we spend months researching everything we can possibly find out about the other party. Their economic situation, their political pressures, their cultural values, their historical precedents, their individual negotiators' personal backgrounds, career ambitions, family situations, hobbies, fears, weaknesses. That's incredibly invasive, Kurthu whispered. That's thorough. Then, we develop multiple negotiation strategies based on different scenarios, complete with contingency plans, backup positions, psychological pressure points, and exit strategies. We prepare for every possible direction the negotiation could go, plus a few impossible directions just in case. And then, Professor Zixthral asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know. Then we show up at the negotiation and pretend we haven't done any of that. We act like we're just friendly, straightforward folks who want to work together to find a fair deal. Meanwhile, we're constantly probing for information, testing reactions, adjusting our strategy based on every micro-expression and verbal tick we can detect. That's psychological warfare, the crystalline student flashed in alarm. That's diplomacy! At least that's human diplomacy. The goal isn't just to get a good deal. Anyone can get a good deal if they're willing to compromise enough. The goal is to get the best possible deal while making the other party think they're getting the best possible deal too. But that's deceptive. That's skilled. Look, diplomacy is basically competitive problem-solving, right? Both parties have objectives they want to achieve, and those objectives probably conflict at least partially, or there wouldn't be anything to negotiate. So the question is, do you want to be good at competitive problem-solving, or do you want to be mediocre at it? Professor Zixthral was beginning to understand why human diplomatic teams had such a formidable reputation, and why other species' diplomatic teams often requested hazard pay when dealing with human negotiators. Mr. Daniel, are you saying that humans treat every diplomatic interaction as a competition? Not every interaction, just the important ones, and the unimportant ones, and especially the ones that seem like they should be simple and straightforward, because those are usually the most dangerous. How can a simple diplomatic interaction be dangerous? Danny's expression suggested this was perhaps the most naive question he'd ever heard. Because simple diplomatic interactions are where you let your guard down. That's when the other party springs their real agenda on you, or tries to slip something past you while you're not paying attention, or sets you up for a bigger play down the line. Or, the Valdorian said hopefully, they genuinely want to have a simple, straightforward diplomatic interaction with no hidden agenda. That's what they want you to think. But you can't be sure until you've thoroughly investigated their motives, analyzed their strategic position, and stress-tested their proposals for hidden complications. And by the time you've done all that, you might as well have treated it as a complex diplomatic interaction in the first place. So humans assume that every diplomatic interaction is potentially hostile? Not hostile. Competitive. There's a difference. Hostile implies that someone wants to hurt you. Competitive just means that everyone wants to get the best possible outcome for themselves, which is perfectly natural and reasonable. Professor Zixthral felt like he was trying to teach quantum mechanics to someone who insisted that mathematics was just a suggestion. Mr. Daniel, most species approach diplomacy as a collaborative process aimed at mutual benefit. Right. And that's why human diplomats are so effective. While everyone else is focused on finding mutually beneficial solutions, we're focused on finding optimally mutually beneficial solutions. We're not trying to hurt anyone. We're trying to help everyone as much as possible, starting with ourselves. That's actually not completely unreasonable, Krathos admitted reluctantly. Exactly. See, the thing about humans is that we're really good at optimization. We take whatever system we're working with and we figure out how to make it work better. Sometimes that means breaking a few rules, bending a few guidelines, or creatively reinterpreting a few established procedures. But the end result is usually an improvement for everyone involved. Usually? Well, okay. Sometimes the end result is a smoking crater where a diplomatic relationship used to be. But that was probably going to happen anyway, and at least our way is faster and more exciting. The professor was now completely certain that this conversation was going to be studied by xenopsychologists for generations. Mr. Daniel, has it occurred to you that other species might prefer slower, less exciting diplomatic processes that don't risk creating smoking craters? Sure, but that's their loss. I mean, where's the sense of accomplishment in a diplomatic success that was basically guaranteed from the start? Where's the thrill of victory when there was never any real possibility of defeat? Most species prefer guaranteed diplomatic success. But then you never know how good you really are. You never push your limits, never discover new techniques, never develop the skills you need to handle really challenging situations. What happens when you finally encounter a diplomatic crisis that can't be solved with careful collaboration and measured compromise? We call in human diplomatic specialists, the Valdorian admitted quietly. Danny beamed with pride. Exactly. And why do you think human diplomatic specialists are so effective at handling impossible situations? The classroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Professor Zixthral felt a growing suspicion that he was witnessing the unveiling of a truth that was going to fundamentally change how the galaxy thought about diplomacy, conflict resolution, and the terrifying effectiveness of Death Worlder psychology. Because, Danny continued cheerfully, we've spent our entire species' history turning impossible situations into recreational activities. Every impossible diplomatic crisis looks like a fun challenge to us. Every unsolvable conflict looks like an interesting puzzle. Every hopeless negotiation looks like a great opportunity to test our skills. That's... Professor Zixthral paused, trying to find words for what that was. That's either the most brilliant approach to diplomacy in galactic history, or the most terrifying. Why not both? Danny asked with a grin that suggested he knew exactly which one it was. And as Professor Zixthral looked around at his class of thoroughly shaken students, all of whom were staring at the human with expressions of horrified fascination, he realized that Danny might just have a point. After all, the galaxy's most challenging diplomatic crises did seem to get resolved remarkably quickly once human specialists were brought in. And the solutions they came up with were often elegantly effective, even if the process of reaching them gave everyone involved a few extra gray scales. You know what? Professor Zixthral said suddenly, surprising himself with his own words. I think we need to completely restructure this course. Danny perked up with interest. Oh? How so? Well, clearly our current curriculum is based on the assumption that all species approach diplomacy from similar foundational principles. But if humans have developed a completely different paradigm... The professor trailed off, his academic mind already racing with possibilities. Are you saying, Krathos asked slowly, that we should learn human diplomatic methods? I'm saying, Professor Zixthral replied, that we should understand them. Whether we choose to adopt them is another question entirely. But ignorance of human diplomatic philosophy has clearly left us unprepared for the realities of modern interspecies relations. The crystalline student pulsed thoughtfully. Query. Would such understanding not require exposure to human-style conflict simulation exercises? Danny's grin widened to proportions that made several students unconsciously lean away from him. Oh, now you're talking! You want to really understand human diplomacy? We'll need to set up some practical exercises. Role-playing scenarios, competitive negotiations, crisis simulations. Absolutely not, Professor Zixthral said quickly. We are not turning my classroom into a human-style diplomatic training ground. The university insurance doesn't cover psychological warfare. It's not psychological warfare. It's psychological strategy. Totally different thing. How is it different? Warfare implies you're trying to defeat your opponent. Strategy just means you're trying to optimize your position while managing theirs. Much more civilized. The Valdorian's clicking was now reaching frequencies that made everyone's translator boxes vibrate ominously. Hypothesis. Human diplomatic effectiveness stems from treating all interactions as optimization problems, rather than cooperative endeavors. Bingo! See, most species approach diplomacy like they're trying to bake a cake together. Everyone contributes ingredients, follows the recipe, and hopes for the best. Humans approach diplomacy like we're playing chess. Every move is calculated, every position is evaluated, and the goal is to control the board. But what happens when both parties are playing chess? Krathos asked. Then you get really interesting diplomacy. The kind where both sides are constantly trying to outmaneuver each other, but they're doing it within agreed-upon rules, so it's competitive, but not destructive. The Cuban Missile Crisis I mentioned earlier? That was basically a 13-day chess match with nuclear weapons instead of pieces. Professor Zix felt his migraine intensifying. And you consider that a positive example? Are you kidding? It's the ultimate example. Both sides played brilliantly. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and in the end, everyone walked away with something they could live with. Plus, it established precedents and communication protocols that prevented similar crises for decades afterward, by nearly ending civilization. But it didn't end civilization. And the fact that it came so close made everyone involved take the whole process much more seriously afterward. Sometimes you have to demonstrate the consequences of failure before people are willing to invest in success. The classroom had descended into the kind of thoughtful silence that usually preceded either breakthrough insights or complete mental breakdowns. Professor Zix wasn't entirely sure which one he was witnessing. Mr. Daniel, he said carefully, are you suggesting that the threat of catastrophic failure is actually beneficial to diplomatic processes? I'm suggesting that the possibility of catastrophic failure is what makes people take diplomacy seriously. If there's no real risk, then there's no real pressure to find creative solutions. But if failure means disaster, then suddenly everyone becomes very motivated to think outside the box. That's... The Valdorian paused, their mechanical brain apparently struggling with the concept. That's actually supported by optimization theory. System performance tends to improve under controlled stress conditions. Exactly. Humans didn't invent this principle. We just figured out how to apply it to social and political systems. A little bit of existential pressure can work wonders for motivation and creativity. Krathos' tentacles had begun forming what might generously be called thoughtful spirals. But how do you control the level of stress? How do you ensure that the pressure promotes solutions rather than causing system failure? Practice, Danny said enthusiastically. Lots and lots of practice. You start with low-stakes situations and work your way up. You develop your skills gradually, build your tolerance for pressure, learn to recognize when you're approaching your limits. This is starting to sound like a training regimen, the crystalline student observed. Because it is. Human diplomatic training is incredibly rigorous. We don't just study theory and precedent. We run simulations, conduct war games, practice crisis management, and stress test our decision-making processes under extreme conditions. Professor Zix blinked in surprise. Human diplomats undergo military-style training? Some of the most intensive training in human society. Diplomatic corps candidates go through years of preparation that makes military basic training look like a relaxing vacation. Psychological conditioning, strategic planning, cultural immersion, negotiation tactics, crisis management, threat assessment. Threat assessment? Krathos interrupted. Oh yeah, that's crucial. You have to be able to identify potential sources of conflict before they become actual conflicts. Environmental factors, economic pressures, political instabilities, cultural tensions, resource competitions, technological disruptions, anything that could destabilize a situation or create leverage opportunities. Leverage opportunities? The Valdorian asked with growing alarm. Sure. If you understand what's motivating the other party, you can structure your proposals to align with their interests. And if you understand what's pressuring them, you can time your negotiations to maximize your advantage. That sounds like manipulation! That sounds like competence. Look, the other party is doing the same thing. At least they are if they're any good at their job. The only question is whether you want to be good at it too, or whether you want to walk into every negotiation as the amateur playing against professionals. Professor Zix was beginning to realize that this conversation was fundamentally changing his understanding of what diplomacy could be. For his entire career, he'd thought of diplomatic relations as a collaborative art form, civilized beings working together to solve mutual problems through reason and compromise. But Danny was describing something much more sophisticated. A competitive discipline that required extensive training, strategic thinking, psychological insight, and the ability to perform under extreme pressure. It was still fundamentally collaborative. Both parties had to agree to any final solution, but the process of reaching that solution was far more complex and demanding than he'd ever imagined. Mr. Daniel, he said slowly, How do human diplomats maintain ethical standards while employing such comprehensive strategies? Oh, that's easy. We have very clear rules about what's acceptable and what isn't. You can gather information, but you can't steal it. You can apply pressure, but you can't threaten harm. You can use psychological insights, but you can't engage in actual manipulation or coercion. You can compete, but you have to compete fairly. And these rules are universally followed? Danny's pause was perhaps a half-second too long. Well, mostly. I mean, the official rules are universally followed. The unofficial rules are more flexible. What unofficial rules? Oh, you know. Things like, don't get caught, maintain plausible deniability, and if everyone's doing it, it's not really cheating. Basic professional courtesy stuff. The classroom's silence had taken on the quality of a vacuum, heavy with the absence of any rational response to what they'd just heard. Mr. Daniel, Professor Zixthral said with remarkable calm. Are you telling this class that human diplomacy operates according to two separate sets of rules, one official and one unofficial, and that the unofficial rules essentially permit behavior that would technically violate the official rules? Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of shady, Danny admitted. But that's how pretty much every competitive field works. Sports have official rules and unwritten rules. Business has legal requirements and industry practices. Military operations have rules of engagement and tactical flexibility. Diplomacy is no different. Diplomacy is supposed to be different! Professor Zixthral exploded, his translator box emitting what sounded like electronic sobbing. Diplomacy is supposed to be the alternative to competitive conflict. Says who? I mean, I know that's the theory, but has that ever actually worked in practice? Because from where I'm sitting, diplomacy is competitive conflict. It's just competitive conflict with rules and consequences that don't involve people dying. Usually, Danny added helpfully. Usually? Well, you can't completely eliminate the possibility of violence from diplomatic interactions. Sometimes negotiations break down. Sometimes people make really bad decisions. Sometimes situations escalate beyond anyone's ability to control them. But the whole point of human-style diplomacy is to make those outcomes as unlikely as possible, while still maintaining the competitive pressure that makes the process effective. Krathos made a sound like a deflating atmospheric processor. You're describing a system that deliberately maintains the threat of violence in order to prevent violence. Exactly. It's like diplomatic nuclear deterrence. Everyone knows that failure could lead to really bad consequences, so everyone has a strong incentive to make sure failure doesn't happen. But the system only works if the threat is credible, which means it has to be real. That's insane. That's effective. Look at the results. Human diplomatic interventions have resolved more galactic crises in the last 50 cycles than all other diplomatic systems combined. And most of those resolutions have been stable, sustainable, and satisfactory to all parties involved. Professor Zixthral stared at Danny for a long moment, feeling the last remnants of his previous worldview crumble into philosophical dust. Mr. Daniel, are you suggesting that the galactic community has been approaching diplomacy incorrectly for thousands of cycles? I'm suggesting that you've been approaching diplomacy safely, which is fine if safety is your primary objective. But if effectiveness is your primary objective, then you might want to consider adopting some human innovations. Such as? Danny's grin was now approaching dimensions that violated several local fire codes. Well, we could start with some basic competitive negotiation exercises. Nothing too intense, maybe just some simple trade disputes or territorial boundary questions. Get everyone comfortable with the idea of actively pursuing their interests rather than just hoping for mutually acceptable compromises. Absolutely not. Come on, it'll be fun. And educational. You'll learn more about real diplomatic dynamics in one afternoon of competitive negotiation than you would in a whole semester of theoretical study. I said no. How about we start with something really simple? Like Krathos wants to buy something from the Valdorian, but they can't agree on a price. Instead of just finding a number that's sort of acceptable to both parties, they have to actually negotiate, research each other's positions, develop strategies, apply pressure, make concessions. I said no. And we could make it more interesting by giving them conflicting information about market conditions, or adding time pressure, or introducing third-party complications. Mr. Daniel. Danny paused, looking genuinely surprised by the professor's vehemence. What? It's just a training exercise. It's psychological warfare disguised as education. No, psychological warfare would be if we were trying to actually damage someone's mental state or decision-making capability. This is just competitive problem-solving with realistic stakes and consequences. What stakes? What consequences? It's a classroom exercise. Well, we'd have to add some, or it wouldn't be realistic. Maybe whoever loses has to do something embarrassing, or everyone else gets to critique their performance, or their grade depends on how well they negotiate. That is psychological warfare. That's motivation. How are they supposed to take it seriously if there are no real consequences for failure? Professor Zixthral felt his sanity finally snap with an almost audible sound. For 47 cycles, he had dedicated his life to the noble pursuit of teaching young beings how to resolve conflicts through reason, compromise, and mutual understanding. He had believed, truly, deeply believed, that diplomacy was the highest expression of civilized behavior, the ultimate demonstration that intelligent beings could transcend their primitive competitive instincts and work together for the common good. And now this human, this enthusiastic, cheerful, utterly terrifying human, was casually explaining that everything he'd spent his career teaching was essentially the diplomatic equivalent of children playing in a sandbox, while adults conducted the real business of interstellar relations through psychological manipulation, strategic deception, and carefully controlled threats of mutual destruction. The worst part was that Danny was probably right. "Mr. Daniel," he said with the careful precision of someone defusing an explosive device, "would you be willing to guest lecture for this class on human diplomatic methodologies?" "Absolutely, but we're definitely going to need to do some practical exercises. You can't really understand human diplomacy just by talking about it. You have to experience the psychological pressure, the strategic decision-making, the real-time adaptation to changing circumstances. Within reason," Professor Zixthral said quickly. "Nothing that would traumatize my students or require medical intervention. Oh, we'll start gentle. Maybe just some basic competitive scenarios where the stakes are low but real. Like, whoever loses has to give a presentation on a topic they find personally embarrassing, or clean the classroom for a week, or answer personal questions from the other students." "That still sounds like psychological warfare to me." "That's because you're thinking about it wrong." "It's not warfare, it's training. We're preparing them for the realities of modern diplomatic practice. And the only way to do that effectively is to create situations where they have to actually use the skills they're learning." Professor Zixthral looked around at his students, all of whom were watching this exchange with expressions that ranged from fascinated horror to horrified fascination. He realized that, regardless of his personal comfort level, they deserved to understand what they were potentially going up against in their future diplomatic careers. "Very well," he said with the resignation of someone accepting an inevitable fate. "But we start with very simple exercises. And if anyone shows signs of psychological distress, we stop immediately." "Deal," Danny said with enthusiasm that would have been reassuring if it weren't so obviously genuine. "This is going to be great. By the end of the semester, your students will have a completely new understanding of what diplomacy can be." Professor Zixthral suspected that by the end of the semester, his students would have a completely new understanding of what life could be. Whether that was a good thing or not remained to be seen. But as he looked around at the faces of Krathos, the Valdorian, the crystalline student, and the small furry creature in the back row, he realized that they were all leaning forward with interest rather than pulling back in horror. Whatever Danny had awakened in them, curiosity, ambition, or just the recognition that the universe was far more complex than they'd imagined, it was already too late to put it back to sleep. "All right then," he said, feeling like someone stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "Mr. Daniel, would you mind outlining what you consider to be the fundamental principles of effective diplomatic practice?" Danny's smile was the sort that made historians reach for their calendars to mark the beginning of new eras. "Oh, Professor," he said with cheerful certainty, "this is going to be so much fun." And as Professor Zixthral watched his carefully ordered academic world transform into something unrecognizable but undeniably exciting, he found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, the human might actually be right about that too. After all, if you were going to have your fundamental assumptions about reality completely overturned, you might as well enjoy the process. Class dismissed. End of transcript. Galactic University course. Recording number 2847. B subject. Advanced Diplomatic Theory and Practice. Date. Cycle 22847. Day 127. Note. Course curriculum significantly revised following this session. Enrollment requests for following semester increased by 340%. Medical staff placed on standby for all future classes. Human Diplomatic Corps contacted for additional educational resources. Response? Finally, send us the best students. We've got some really interesting scenarios we'd love to test. University insurance rates increased by 15%. Professor Zixthral granted extended sabbatical for psychological recovery and curriculum development. Student evaluations for the semester averaged 4.8 out of 5 stars. Common comment. Terrifying but incredibly educational. Danny received perfect scores across all categories. Special commendation for fundamentally altering academic perspectives through casual conversation. The Fizzblat in the back row turned out to be an undercover correspondent for the Galactic Educational Review. Article published 3 days later titled, "The Day Diplomacy Died and Was Reborn as Competitive Sport." Human diplomatic training programs experienced 400% increase in applications from non-human species. The phrase human-style negotiation entered standard galactic diplomatic vocabulary. Professor Zixthral's subsequent research paper, Death World Diplomacy, Rethinking Conflict Resolution in the Post-Human Era, became the most cited academic work in galactic diplomatic history. Danny went on to establish the first interspecies strategic negotiation academy,